Welcome everybody to New Findings Revealed, our webinar today launching the Causes Count, the Economic Power of California's Nonprofit Sector report. We do have new findings here in 2019 that we're very excited to share with you. Our two presenters today will be Jan Masaoka, our CEO, and Nancy Berlin, our Policy Director. If you want to go to the next slide, Jan, we'll cover a couple of housekeeping things and then I'll turn it over to them for the fun stuff. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan Masaoka, Cal Nonprofit CEO, to get started talking about Causes Count. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Christina. We're all really happy to be doing this, and we're very excited about it. And we're so excited that we have way too many slides for the time allowed. So I just want to tell you, we're going to kind of zip through this. So let me just start off with this. So you've probably seen 100 economic impact studies, right? We see them all the time about this or that, or new railway, or a stadium, or a port, or an airport, or anything. So, but it's interesting that until we did the first Causes Count study a few years ago, there had never been one about the California's nonprofit sector. So this is kind of the second edition, Causes Count, and this is something we did in partnership with the University of San Diego's and our researchers, and one of them is as you mentioned earlier, Christina, is Mary Jo Schumann, who's also a member of our board. So they really did the heavy lifting and the research, and so we're very happy to have been able to partner with them again on it. Right. This is a list of the data sources, which I'm not going to go over, but I just want to impress you with how the fact that we are using lots of data sources. This is most of them quantitative and objective sources. So there are 2 surveys part of it, but most of them are really original research work done. You can see with a variety of different original sources. So we don't have time to have you fill out the polls online. So we are just going to go ahead and ask you to think about the answer to the question and keep it in your mind. So let me ask this question. All right. So nonprofits produce what % of California's GDP? Is it 4%? Is it 9%? Is it 15%? Okay. If you've thought about what your answer will be, here's the answer: 15%. So California's nonprofit sector puts out 1/6 of California's gross state product, which is a really high amount, and it's an indicator, one of the first indicator we're going to show you today about California nonprofits' economic power. Right. By the way, I should also say you can write in comments too into the Q&A box. It don't have to be a question, like comments like, this is the most interesting statistic I've ever heard in my entire life. We like comments like that. All right, so here's another question. How many California jobs is it a nonprofit? Is it 1 out of every 14 jobs, 26 jobs, or 1 out of every 39 jobs? Does everybody have an answer in their mind? The answer is 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. In fact, if all the staff in California who were in California's nonprofit community, we would be the 45th largest state. And of course, other states would have 2 senators, but we don't have 2 senators, which is why we have to do other things to make our voices heard.
And so Jan, yeah. we're job creators, right?
Well, yes, exactly. We're job creators, and that's this next slide, which says that the nonprofit sector is California's 4th largest industry by employment. We employ more people than construction. And imagine how many times you've heard people say, what is the construction industry going to say about that? Well, we think people should also be saying, what does the nonprofit community think about that? As well. And that idea that we're job creators, as Nancy mentioned, that's one of the most important messages that all of us can take away from this report, that we aren't, hangers on at the margins of the economy. We're actually very central as very important employers.
Jan, do you know how we compare nationally in terms of job creation?
We're a little bit higher than other states are in percentage of jobs, and I think, I think that's a testament to what we do here in California. One of the things just interesting, if you've ever seen those articles or like magazines and stuff where they're like airline magazines where they're trying to get companies and people to move to a certain area, and they'll tell you, for example, why you should move to such and such a city, and they'll usually say because there's beautiful parklands, there's great universities, there's good hospitals and medical care, there's a wonderful theater and an orchestra. And in other words, when they try to lure people to cities, they all point to the things that California nonprofits do. All right, so in addition to our staff, there are more than 4.8 million people who volunteer to help California's communities. And in fact, if you take all their hours and you convert them into 40-hour weeks, it's the equivalent of 331,000 full-time staff. So these are huge donations from these people, but it's also something, resources that we mobilize and bring to bear on the issues facing California communities. And in fact, if you take all the hours of all the staff and all the volunteers together, 22% of them are volunteers. And actually, I just finished writing a written piece that'll come out later this month on how we in the staff part of the nonprofit sector often overlook the importance of volunteers. In the written report, full report too, there's also some information about kind of some troubling signs of volunteerism rates declining and what we might think about doing about that. This is probably the single most important statistic that we say in Sacramento, and that is that nonprofits bring more than $40 billion into California from out of state. And how do we do that? That's a huge amount of money. We do it because we bring federal money into California. We do it because foundations from out of state give us money, like the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, or the Gates Foundation. And in addition, California nonprofits raise money from individual contributors all over the world. When you think about organizations like the Sierra Club that are headquartered here in California, so all of these things. So I think it's very important for all of us to feel and to communicate the fact that nonprofits are not kind of leeches on the existing economy. We're actually job creators, and we bring more than $40 billion into California from out of state. That's one of the most important things for legislators at local and statewide levels to hear. All right, so now Nancy's turn.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. That's a really big number, that 40 billion. And so what does that look like though when we get into what we get as nonprofits? So here's another little quiz question to think about for a minute. 37% of nonprofit funding, which is the largest slice, comes from one of these. And we're not including hospitals or universities here because that would skew it too much. So does that big chunk come to us from foundations, from the government, from fee-for-service, from individuals, corporations, or squeezed from stones? Squeezed from stones is my personal experience, but in fact, the biggest proportion comes from fee-for-service, or we a lot of times think of that as program revenue. And I think that's surprising for a lot of folks when they see this, that we tend to think it's either individual donations or foundation grants, for instance. A lot of people think that. And but if you think about it more in terms of your own experience with nonprofits, some of you already know this. So it's for instance, the fees that you pay to your Little League, or for the after school program or childcare center, or a museum that you've been to recently. All those are fee for services. And they're a really important part of the revenue mix for nonprofits. Yeah. Oh, and of course, this varies quite a bit by what sector or subsector you're in, and you can see that here. So it can be that program revenue is really large for something like a hospital. As we all know, they charge you when you walk in the door, or even for education or health services. But then as you go down, you'll see other mixes. And one that we're going to talk about more in a minute, it has to do with the money that we get as nonprofits from government. So when you get down that chart a little bit and you look at human services, you'll see that quite a bit of human services organizational funding does come from the government. And you know, one of the things I think about when I look at this this particular chart is that we often tend to think that there's one way to fund a nonprofit, but this shows you that there's lots of different mixes, and there isn't a right mix for any particular one. It really depends on what you do as a nonprofit and where you can get money and what your business model looks like.
Yeah. It's also interesting because it shows that we're all kind of hybrid organizations. We all have multiple types of revenue.
Right, right. We wanted to drill down in this particular causes count a little bit more on what government funding looks like for nonprofits. It was not something we looked at particularly in depth last time. But we've heard from everyone, we've seen ourselves how important this revenue stream is. And so you'll see here, this was our attempt to try to describe, not only for us and you, but for decision makers and public officials, about what does this revenue stream look like. And we get quite a bit of money, nonprofits collectively, from the federal government, but it comes to us in different ways. And so sometimes we don't even know what the actual source is. Is it local money? Is it federal money? Is it state money? So you can see here on the far left that there is some federal money that goes directly from the feds. Oh, there we go. That's okay. To nonprofits. There is quite a bit of money, though, that also goes from the federal government to the state. And then the state either grants it out to local governments like your city or your county. Sometimes some of us do get money directly from the state to nonprofits. So there are these different channels. They're not completely discrete or distinct, but this gives you some idea of what it looks like. So to give you an idea of how that works, here's one example that we include in our report about human services money, since a big chunk of human services providers get their money from the government, but it comes to us in different ways. So as I said, for instance, here you'll see that a lot of the money that comes directly from the federal government to nonprofits comes for things like HUD housing, or some of you who do Head Start programs. That's one way where the feds will often directly fund a nonprofit. More likely, though, you'll see that your money comes from the state through a pass-through system. So some examples are some of the nutrition programs through USDA, and a lot of foster care money comes that way, directly from the state to nonprofits. And perhaps even more likely for many of us, it comes through the county or city or some local jurisdiction. So a lot of times we're not even sure where it comes from exactly. There's a lot of different ways that happens. The TANF money, which we in California call CalWorks, or a lot of the community development block grant money. I think that's where a lot of us see this as coming from. And it's a very important part of the mix, but it can be confusing when you don't know where your money is coming from directly. This is really just to say that there's this real interdependency between government and nonprofits. And this is a very important message that we're hoping that you'll help us deliver and to our government officials, that it's a two-way street, really, that governments rely on nonprofits to provide services that they either can't provide or would rather have done at a nonprofit level, and nonprofits rely on the government for that revenue mix. And so one place where this is really obvious is that the government relies on nonprofits to provide Medi-Cal services, a lot of Medi-Cal services, and then nonprofits rely on the government for 30% of their revenue. So it goes back and forth. And it is a partnership, but as we'll talk about in a minute, it's not necessarily an equal partnership. This will not come as a surprise to almost anyone on this call right now. But although we get a lot of money from the government, it can be fraught with problems. And 68% of nonprofits report that the payments that they get don't cover the full cost of the services that they're providing. We've heard that over and over again. This is not just us in California, this is throughout the country, but it is a very big problem to then have to do whatever else you do, have your gala dinners or bake sales or whatever, although it is a little difficult then, because you're trying to raise money for a service you've already said you're going to provide, but you don't have all the overhead, for instance, like you don't your contracted services from the government, for instance, may not include your insurance costs or you're a bookkeeper or something like that. And that makes it much harder.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the ways that we've been trying to address some of the difficulties in addition to the ones you just seen there, another difficulty that nonprofits have told us is that they don't know how to get this government money, even though there's a lot of it that we do get. And we couldn't figure out a way to tackle this on the federal level, but at the state level, we did find, we're hoping, a vehicle to help with that. A lot of you had told us that it was very difficult to figure out where state money comes from and how to get a hold of it. So many of you probably remember that last year we got through a bill, we sponsored it, and it was authored by Assemblymember Monique Limon. And it is now a law. It's the Grant Information Act of 2018. And the idea here is this we are now creating a searchable database, a one-stop portal online where you'll be able to look for all the different kinds of state government money that's out there. It'll be up and running. We're pretty sure we've got high hopes it'll be up and running in July 2020, so not that far away. Many of you helped us pass this. A lot of you are helping us in the design phase. It really is something we're all working on together, and we have high hopes. So we look forward to talking to you next summer about how it's going and when it launches. So this is also something that you probably intuitively know, though you might not think about, but it is an important public policy data point to get across, which is that we are kind of like a sector of family farms. We're not, most of us are not very big. And in fact, about 66% of us are pretty small with expenses of $50,000 or less, which is not what we hear of a lot, but you all know this yourselves. And really only 2% have over 10 million. So a lot of you on the phone may be somewhere in the middle there, but you know that we're not typically very large as nonprofits, and we still get a lot done, kind of like your family farms or your small local business down the street. And that's a good way for us to think about ourselves as a community.
I think the $50,000 is also the rule of thumb that's used for when nonprofits hire staff. So another way, kind of shorthand way to think about it is that of all the nonprofits that there are in California, 2/3 of them are all volunteer organizations.
Right, and that's a good point, Jan. And there are a lot of volunteer organizations that we know and we rely on a lot. A lot of our children's sports leagues are volunteers, our friends of the libraries who help in our libraries. There's lots of good examples. In addition to government money, of course, we do get money, nonprofits do get money from foundations. And similarly, though, it doesn't equally come to us. It really does depend on what kind of nonprofit we are and the kinds of services we provide. So, but the other interesting thing is that some of those foundations are local in California and some of them are outside of California. And you can see here, it's a little hard to read this, but you can see the orange are grants that come from California foundations, and the darker color is the ones that come outside of California. So you can also see here, of course, that health and education get the biggest dollars, the biggest philanthropic dollars, and it kind of trickles down from there.
But it is still kind of interesting to look at something like arts and culture and to see that the money that foundations give to arts and cultures, 22% of it comes from out-of-state foundations.
Yeah, we don't think about that a lot. That's true.
No, we don't. Oh, this is my section now, Disparities Matter. Do we have time for a couple of questions though, Christina?
Yes, I think we could
Okay.
do. There's one question there appears to be a noticeable lack of environmental focus among the largest federally funded grant programs to nonprofits. Do you see that possibly changing with the advent of global warming and its consequences?
Nancy, can you want to respond to that?
Well, hang on. Well, I think one of the, I don't think so right away. And I would say that because of the politics of the situation that we're in right now, that I just don't think that's going to be a big federal priority. So I'm not imagining that a lot of money is going to come that way. It could be that local money or state money could become available, but you have a really good point on that question, but I'm not optimistic.
Do you have one more question, Christina?
I'm looking.
Yes. So how is equity and diversity to funding being addressed to smaller nonprofits?
Well, that's coming up a little bit.
Okay.
Although I would say one thing about that at the state level, that is one of the reasons why we sponsored the Grant Information Act, because what we did see is that the organizations and the nonprofits that did get state funding tended to be in urban areas or in more in wealthier communities, or they were more connected somehow or another. And we don't really know what those disparities look like, but we heard enough stories that we thought it was true. So the other thing that we're hoping is that once we begin to collect more of this information, as we have this grant information database, we'll also be able to see where those disparities are and talk to government officials about how to change that.
Yeah, we actually have pretty good data in the full report about how federal money is distributed in a non-equitable way, but state government funding is so it's very difficult to aggregate it, so we don't really know, and so that's the Grant Information Act will help us on that one as well. Okay, let's go on. Here's another quiz question. Who has more money? Northern California nonprofits, Southern California nonprofits, or this is why we should be 6 states. And this is another way of telling which part of the state you live in, because if you live in Northern California, you probably think it's Southern California and the other way around. Well, the answer is Northern California. So this line across the middle there that you see, that's at the top of Kern County, right above Bakersfield. And it's a line where about half of California's population lives north of that line and about half lives south of that line. And if you look in these squares here on this side, you can see that Northern California nonprofits have about $3,245 per resident, whereas Southern California nonprofits have $2,322. So sometimes I like to joke with our Southern California members that they should think about moving to Northern California as a way of getting more money. But it is interesting what a sharp disparity that is, even with such a broad division as North and South. And then which nonprofits have more money? Is it rural nonprofits or is it metropolitan nonprofits? Is it poorer communities or is it wealthier communities? Is it mostly people of color communities or is it in mostly white communities? And this one is so easy. Okay, you should know this one, right? So the fact is that there are tremendous disparities here in all 3 of these categories. And this is something that we go into quite a bit of detail in the full written report that we don't have time for today, but I did want to give you 2 slides to talk a little bit about these disparities. Now you can see here, I know you can't study this online here, but you can see that we have every one of California's 58 counties here. And the darker the color is, the more orange it is, the more money they have, and the kind of paler that it is, it shows you how much less money they have. And so taking an example, just to pick out a few counties to point out, total nonprofit revenue percentage per resident, the high is in San Francisco, $14,071. So that means all the nonprofits together, we got $14,000 per San Francisco County resident. And then you can look at these other ones, Santa Clara, Silicon Valley, $5,232, kind of these really shocking numbers, Del Norte, 405, and Amador, 273. So you can see that and to some degree that these numbers here reflect both the metropolitan versus rural, as well as the issue of kind of wealthier communities versus poorer communities. But you'll see a lot more detail on these kinds of disparities in the full written report. And to us, this is really a call to action. It's a call to action for government to look at more equitable distribution of government funds. It's a call to action for foundations and for individual givers, not just to give where your neighbors are, but to give to where the places are that people don't have as much money per resident. And also a call for us in nonprofits to think about, what can we do if we're in one of the areas that has more money to support those organizations that are in areas that have less money. So of course, because we're a policy coalition, one of the things we wanted to know is how much do nonprofits in general participate in policy? And really, these are such amazing numbers. Within the last 12 months, 76% of nonprofits said that they had met with public officials or their staff. So that says, we are talking with public officials all the time. It's not sort of something that a few advocacy nonprofits do once in a while. Most of us are doing something like this. More than half of us belong to a coalition that lobbies, like we lobby on behalf of organizations. So does, for example, the California Association of Museums or the California Association of Food Banks. And you can see that 50%, we wish this were a little higher, but 50% encourage constituents to vote. And we're going to be, again, in the coming year, we're going to be expanding the services that we're doing to help nonprofits on census, as well as on voter engagement and voter mobilization. And you probably remember these buttons from our campaign. I work for a nonprofit and I vote. Excuse me. This is our next to the last slide. And the thing is, what we want to say is that whenever you're in a room where somebody says something like, what does the business community think? Or what does the chamber think? Or what does the construction industry have to say about that? Those are important questions, and we should raise our hands and say, what does the nonprofit community think in addition? Because we know that when nonprofits are at the table, we say all the right things, all the important things, and we have very compelling stories to tell. But we need to be asked to that table. So it's important for us, this is what we ask legislators. If you are in a hearing and somebody says, what does the business community think? We want people to ask, what do the nonprofit community think as well? And you can see, California, of course, has a bear as our state animal, and this is kind of our little nonprofit bear in the lower right-hand corner. All right, so I want to just finish a couple things. We're very happy you could be here today. One of the things we did was say that if you attended this webinar, you would be put into a drawing, and 3 of you will get mailed a free copy of this full study. And it was handed, they did the drawing in our other part of our office. And our 3 winners today are Bela Marks, Sandra Guerrero, and Cynthia Sanchez. So you'll be getting that in your mail. I want to say this is slightly embarrassing, but we're having a little bit of trouble on the printing side, so the full report isn't ready today in print. It is ready online, and you can download it with that link there, or go to our website and you'll see it on the front page, and you can have a look there and you can download the whole report for free. You can also get an order form there, so we will be able to mail you one the instant that they actually come back to the office in print form. One of the things we did more than 40 presentations around the state with the last causes count, and we'll be doing more this time. So if there's a conference, for example, of nonprofits, or a large meeting that you would like to have us come and make this same presentation at, that would be great. And I also want to say this is the launch day, and it's the first day that we've done this presentation. So it's especially important for you to give us feedback on it so that we can get better at this. What slides do you wish we had on it, or which slides felt kind of redundant to you? That kind of thing will really help us improve as we go forward. And oh, sorry. And I also just wanted to say that if you're not already a member of Cal Nonprofits, we hope that you'll join. The membership dues represent about 1/3 of our total revenue. So you can see that when we say we rely on membership dues, we really, really mean it. And that's the kind of thing that allows us to do this kind of really important research information that will be useful to so many nonprofits in the future. So we're exactly 12:30. We've used up our time. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Christina. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And please be sure to download this and talk about it and let us know your thoughts about it. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of the day.